Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
We hear now from our correspondents in the United States. First, Greg Barrow in New York.
This was a strike at the very heart of modern America. During the early morning rush hour, 2 passenger planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. Within an hour, this symbol of America's business strength had collapsed into a pile of dust, rubble and smoke. And amongst those who witnessed this tragedy, there's a feeling now that nowhere is safe, even on the mainland of the United States. The attack in Manhattan has caused utter chaos. The island, one of the most densely populated areas in the United States, has been virtually cut off. All tunnels in and out of the city have been closed. The public transport system has been shut down and telecommunication systems have been disrupted.
Outside Washington, the Pentagon building was also hit by a plane, while the State Department was targeted by what some reports suggested was a bomb attack. Our correspondent Johnny Diamond is in the American capital.
The nation's capital has known nothing like it. The offices of the federal government lie empty, abandoned by workers. Civil servants fled their buildings soon after the attack on the Pentagon. A commercial jetliner crashed into the building, sending up what one eyewitness described as a huge orange fireball. Another witness said the plane seemed to accelerate as it descended. Part of the Pentagon's structure has collapsed. Thick smoke is pouring from the building, which is being doused by fire hoses. Helicopters and a fighter jet have been seen flying over the capital. There is no word of injuries. 24,000 people work in the building. The attack on the Pentagon was followed by unconfirmed reports of a car bomb outside the State Department. A 2-block area around the White House has been cordoned off. Emergency services are struggling to get through the gridlocked traffic. Police with automatic weapons are patrolling directly in front of the White House. Following the attack on the World Trade Center, the president, who was in Florida, said he would return to Washington. Given that the White House, Congress, the State Department and the Pentagon have all been evacuated, that plan has been abandoned. The president has instead landed in Louisiana.
You're listening to the news from the BBC. The attacks have caused chaos in the world's financial markets. Wall Street shut down after the planes hit the World Trade Center, and stock exchanges across America were closed as thousands of employees were sent home and tall buildings evacuated. The value of the dollar plunged, along with share prices in Europe. The events in the United States have caused widespread chaos in airports around the world. The organization that supervises all air traffic circulation in Europe, Eurocontrol, has suspended all European flights to the United States. Canada's airports have been shut down, although they will allow the landing of all US transatlantic flights diverted to the country. BBC World Service News.
You're listening to a BBC World Service News special. I'm Lise Doucette. It's been an unprecedented day, the most audacious act of terrorism committed anywhere in the world. It's still impossible to say how many lives have been lost, but it's clear the figures are very high indeed. President George W. Bush had said the nation's resolve was being tested. He said American forces were on high alert across the United States and around the world. Well, for the latest now, let's join our correspondents in New York and Washington. John Line is in the nation's capital, and also from New York we have Greg Barrow. First to you, John Line, just how much has life been disrupted in Washington after a plane crashed this morning into the Pentagon Defense Headquarters?
It's basically ground to a halt here. This is a city that relies on federal business. Many people here work for the federal government, and all those offices pretty much have been closed down. So the centre of the city is in gridlock. Unlike in New York, of course, this plane crash was just outside the centre. The Pentagon is on the other side of the river from most of the rest of Washington. So it didn't quite directly impact on people the way those attacks in Manhattan did. However, the whole city is ground to a halt. Some strange vestiges of normality. The subway system is still working. There are still some tourists around here because they have basically nowhere else to go, but work has ceased here.
Greg Barrow in New York, huge plumes of black smoke were seen billowing from the towers, which of course later collapsed. What's the scene now at what's left of the World Trade Center?
Well, it's very difficult to get even remotely close to the World Trade Center. The roads in that southwestern corner of Manhattan Island have been sealed off, and members of the public and the media are being kept away. And there's good reason for that, because soon after those two planes crashed into the World Trade Center this morning, people began to gather near the base of the building, and then it was only a matter of minutes before those two huge towers, two of the tallest constructions in the world, suddenly cascaded to the ground in this huge mess of rubble and glass and metal. So I think the priority is to keep people away and keep them back from that scene, and as a result the rest of Manhattan Island has become extremely clogged up with traffic and people who were on their way into work in the city when this happened. An
indication yet about how many people died when two aircraft plowed into those two towers?
No indication yet. We only know that around 150 people may have been on the two aircraft which ploughed into those towers. We know that on a busy day when the World Trade Center is full of all of the people who work there, up to 50,000 work in those two towers. Now this incident happened during rush hour, as people would have been turning up at the building, maybe going to their desks to begin their day of work. It's unclear whether the building was filled. It's also unclear how many people the emergency services managed to evacuate from that building before the collapse of both towers took place. What we can only assume is that once that collapse took place, anyone inside would have perished.
And John Lyon, the extent of casualties in Washington?
Again, people just aren't talking about that yet, apart from the hundreds of people we know must have been killed on board the planes that crashed. It's just too early to estimate. I mean, the fire is still burning at the Pentagon. I went past there not so long ago, and a huge, great black smoke, a horrible smell coming from there. So they're still fighting the fire, they're still pulling people out. The only single number I've heard is one hospital saying they received 26 people injured, but it's hard to think that people wouldn't have been killed within the Pentagon itself, let alone on that plane.
And still no statements at all as to who may have been behind this?
No, and interesting, nobody in the US government blaming any individual groups yet, so clearly the word does not seem to be around yet who may have been responsible.
John Lyon in New York and John Lyon in Washington. Greg Barrow in New York, thank you for joining us here on the BBC. So the devastating today all began in the early morning rush hour in New York. Here in London, my colleague Alex Brody was on air on the BBC World Service when it all started to happen, and now he looks back on the day's events. Alex.
It looked at first like a terrible accident, a plane crashing into New York's tallest skyscraper. Then, cameras trained on the smoking tower picked up another plane, banking and lining up to crash into the second tower. Two planes, a tower each. The BBC's correspondent Steve Evans was in the World Trade Center.
I was in the base of the building, in the foyer, when there was one huge thump. It sounded like a full skip of garbage being dropped from a great height. I thought no more of it, but the building did physically shake. A few seconds after that, there were two more big crashes, and people started screaming around me and running, just screaming, "Get out, get out."
Witnesses could hardly believe what they were seeing.
I saw the first explosion at about 8:30, which I thought was a building being demolished behind me. I was standing down on Battery Park, and you just saw sort of clouds of smoke coming up, which nobody was bothered at all, you know, we just thought it was building work going on in New York. And then suddenly you just saw flames coming out of the first tower, and then probably about 20 minutes later, this plane just flew so low across our head and smashed into the, you know, it looked like it was heading directly for the other tower, and smashed into the tower, just burst into flames. It was just something out of a horror movie.
I had a perfect view, and the plane was coming in. I noticed it a second before it hit the building. It looked like it was moving slowly, and it lined itself up to hit the building directly.
Big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
The financial heart of America was under attack. With the upper stories of the two towers burning, both collapsed into Manhattan. Had other bombs exploded within the weakened buildings to bring them down? The political heart of the United States was also attacked. A third hijacked airliner was crashed into the Pentagon, the Defense Department. How did the hijackers get the pilots to crash their planes the way they wanted? Or were the hijackers themselves pilots? Who in the world could possibly put this attack together? a question clearly on the mind of the President of the United States, who was swiftly on the air.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
It was bad, unbelievably bad, but it got worse, and the next time Mr. Bush spoke, he did not need to refer to an apparent terrorist attack.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
President Bush in New York, they daren't start to think about how many people may be dead. Put it this way, there have been 4 passenger airliner crashes, 2 in New York, 1 in Washington, 1 in Pittsburgh. The number of dead in those plane crashes may well be exceeded by the number of casualties in New York. A senior US senator said, "This is the second Pearl Harbor." Another voice amid the pandemonium said, "This will change everything." Please.
Alex Brody, an extraordinary day indeed. It's still not clear who did it or how they did it. Joining us here in the studio is the BBC's defence analyst, Jonathan Marcus, and the BBC Middle East specialist, Roger Hardy. Jonathan Marcus, just how sophisticated an operation would this have to be?
Well, clearly reasonably sophisticated to get knowledge of the airports, the schedules, the flight paths of the particular aircraft. And clearly it's been meticulously planned, and there would be a significant number of people involved. I think, though, what's interesting about today's extraordinary chain of events is that there's been a lot of talk in recent years in the United States about America's vulnerability. It seemed very strange to many of us abroad. Here you had the last remaining superpower, this extraordinary, overwhelming military force around the world, but yet lots and lots of talk about homeland defense, the vulnerability of the United States, and so on. And all this talk about asymmetric warfare, this idea of the war of the weak against the strong, that nobody would any longer go into battle against the United States because it did have such overwhelming military power, but that people, shadowy groups who didn't like America and what it stood for, would seek other ways of attacking the very heart of the United States itself. Now, today's chain of events, I think, has, in a sense, answered those concerns in the most terrible way you can imagine, and I think it's going to cast a shadow over the American defense debate for a very long time to come.
And not just cast a shadow, but indeed could concentrate minds on rethinking it?
Well, there'll be some rethinking. I mean, you can hardly say America doesn't need armed forces just because the threat appears to be, the most evident threat appears to be a terrorist threat. I think, though, there's going to be a lot of hard thinking about the way the United States deals with intelligence matters and deals with the threat from terrorism. President Bush had charged Vice President Dick Cheney quite soon after he came into office to look again at the way American agencies coordinate, and there are literally dozens of agencies that fight the war against terrorism, if you want to call it that. So I think there's going to be a lot of hard thinking there. A lot of questions will be asked about why there wasn't more warning. There has been a shadowy campaign waged between the United States and these groups, very much away from the public eye. There have been successes on both sides. We hear about the bombings. We don't necessarily hear about the attacks that have been thwarted. But clearly, this attack seems to have come, the analogy was made with Pearl Harbor in 1941. It has come out of the blue. And I think it is. I mean, that phrase, things will not be the same again, I think this is going to change a great deal about the way America thinks about itself and about the way it thinks about its place in the world.
And indeed, it's still not clear at all, no hints at all as to who might be responsible. Roger Hardy, any sense at all from anywhere in the world as to who might have been behind this today?
Well, clearly, anything one says at this stage has to be speculation, but I think it is reasonable speculation to say that the one network that has both the motivation, in other words, a burning, burning hatred of America, and at least arguably the high-tech capability and the degree of organization and, of course, the funding, has to be the Osama bin Laden network. Osama bin Laden, the Saudi dissident based in Afghanistan, who clearly has been waging a holy war, a jihad against America for more than 3 or 4 years now.
And we've seen a mixed reaction across the Middle East. In some areas, condemnation, in others, celebration.
I think it is a genuine mixture. I think it would be wrong to say that everybody in the Middle East or that everybody in the Muslim world shares this burning hostility against America. Many people have grievances against the Americans, for example, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue and a whole host of other international issues. But this doesn't mean that necessarily that they support international terrorism. But there are some groups, there are some people, for example, some Palestinians in Gaza who are tonight applauding.
Roger Hardy, Jonathan Marcus, thank you very much for joining us. And a reminder that you're listening to a BBC World Service News Special. I'm Lise Doucette. For our listeners who've just joined us, a reminder of today's story. There's been a series of coordinated attacks in the United States, causing devastation and loss of life. 2 airliners deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. Both buildings collapsed. A 3rd plane crashed into the Pentagon Defense Headquarters in Washington. A 4th crashed near Pittsburgh. President George W. Bush has said those responsible would be hunted down and punished. All government buildings, including the White House, have been evacuated, and all civilian aircraft in the United States have been grounded. International airline travel is in a state of chaos. Correspondents say the United States is effectively on a war footing. Well, exactly what does that mean? We're joined now from the United States by Richard Pearl. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense under the Reagan administration. Richard Pearl, welcome to our news special. Just how shocking are today's events for the defense establishment?
Well, very shocking indeed. The commission of a terrorist act on this scale, which is unprecedented, which many thousands of people will have lost their lives, is bound to be a shock.
And does it suggest huge security lapses in intelligence and protection?
Well, clearly there was an intelligence failure. That is, we were not aware of the impending attack. I believe that this will produce a change in American policy toward terrorism, away from focusing on individual terrorists, many of whom committed suicide in the course of this terrorist act, and toward the governments that support terrorism, because they can't hide, and we know who they are.
But even before this attack, Washington was said to be extremely vigilant about possible attacks, about possible vulnerabilities, and even with that, this happens. How can that be?
Well, you cannot, through intelligence means alone, stop every act of terrorism. That's been demonstrated today. It was obvious before today. What we have not done until now, and I think there's a very good chance that that will change, is hold responsible the governments who support terrorists, who recruit them, who train them, who finance them, who give them safe haven, who assist them. Because without that government support, without state support to terrorism, the magnitude of the threat would be very much smaller and perhaps manageable by intelligence means.
But of course, we don't know yet who is responsible for this devastating attack.
We don't know specifically, but we know that the governments of Iraq and Iran and Syria and Libya, for example, and all support terrorism, permit terrorists to operate on their territory, and provide them with the means to carry out attacks of this nature. And I believe that we will now look to those governments and try to develop policies that will hold them responsible.
And just how comprehensive will it be? Could it have a knock-on effect on the plans for a national missile defense shield, which is supposed to be the centerpiece of defending American cities from attack?
Well, no, it is only one element of a broad program of defending American cities from attack. I think that the case for a defense against a ballistic missile has been strengthened by today's events. It is, if anyone doubted it, it is now clear that there are people who would do massive damage to the United States if given an opportunity. Fortunately, terrible as this was, they had airplanes and not nuclear weapons. And they were able to deliver this devastation not by a missile with a weapon of mass destruction. So that is a threat that we have to remain vigilant with respect to, since we now have no defense against such missiles. But we obviously also need to deal with the terrorist threat, and the solution there, at least the mitigating policy, will be to hold governments responsible so they stop giving the kind of support without which terrorists cannot function.
Well, given the lapses in intelligence that this has demonstrated, how difficult will it be to, as George Bush has said, to hunt down and punish the attackers?
Well, punishing the attackers, the individuals, seems to me quite beside the point. What we know is that if you are a terrorist and you are inclined to attack the United States, you will get help and assistance in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Sudan, and elsewhere. And once we begin to hold those governments responsible, they will have to decide whether to take the risks involved in supporting terrorism. Up until now, it's been without risk.
In many aspects of George W. Bush's policy since he came to power, he's made it clear that America will act on its own to defend its own interest. But when it comes to this, in a heightened sense of vulnerability, will it also look for a more coordinated response to this terrorism?
Well, of course, we would like to see others who might well have been the victims of terrorist attacks working together with us. We can only ask for cooperation. We can't demand it. But what we can do is take action against the governments that permit this sort of thing to happen.
Richard Pearl, former Assistant Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan's administration in the United States, thank you very much for joining us here on the BBC. And of course, there's a heightened sense of vulnerability in many other capitals around the world, including Moscow. Let's go now to join Andrei Kozyrev, the former Soviet foreign minister, joining us live here on a BBC World News special. Andrei Kozyrev, just how much vulnerability is there being felt in Moscow?
Well, I'm very satisfied, actually, and even proud with the reaction from Moscow to this tragedy in the United States. President Putin was very quick to make total condemnation and offering whatever help and support he could. And the tone of commands, of other official commands here in Moscow, is very sympathetic, very friendly, and straight to the point, condemning terrorism, whatever the source and the reason. So that's very good. And they also had a very high-level, top-level, actually, meeting immediately after the news came in Moscow under President Putin's leadership, and they took some measures, including high alert on air defenses and civil action also here. I mean, a civil defense action going on in preventive terms. So I think it was received like the threat also to Moscow, to Russia. And that's right. I think we have to unite against this type of horrible criminals.
But in political terms, you wouldn't see this attack as being essentially one against American interest, American symbols of power?
No, I think it's very good, again, that in Russia, nobody speaks of only America to be attacked. I think even government speaks of we all are under attack. So I think it is very encouraging that maybe this tragedy will bring us closer together. I mean, Russia and the West, the United States.
Indeed, we heard from the United States, from Richard Pearl, an expert on defense matters, saying they wanted to get tougher with the backers of terrorism. Is that something that Moscow would go along to? Moscow, despite, of course, its big defense industry and sales worldwide?
Yeah, I think it will take some diplomatic effort, but hopefully this situation would really waken up a lot of people on both sides to actually put their heads together and start looking into that the threat, because it's evident that those terrorists were organized, like 4 airplanes. It means that it was organized, that it's not just one individual, two individuals. So there is a source of this terrorism, and it could happen to any country, because for them, I mean, Russia or United States are so-called great Satans. So I hope that the officials on both sides will be much more forthcoming and much more cooperative to each other.
Former Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, thank you very much for joining us from Moscow. And a reminder, you're listening to a BBC World Service News special. I'm Lise Doucette. On a day unlike any other day, an audacious act of terrorism, an unprecedented act of terrorism committed in the United States. Catastrophic loss of life and destruction after 3 apparently hijacked passenger aircraft flew into the World Trade Center in New York and into Pentagon Defense Headquarters in Washington. The World Trade Center towers and part of the Pentagon collapsed after the attacks. They took place during morning rush hour when thousands of office workers would have been going to work. A 4th airliner also crashed outside the city of Pittsburgh. No indications so far of who is behind the attacks. President George W. Bush has vowed to hunt down and punish the attackers. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain, said there were no adequate words to describe what he called barbarism, a shame for all eternity. Well, emergency measures are being taken not just in the United States, but across Europe. Let's go to Paris now to join Bernard Valbro.
And what say we stay here in Tucson and give you some local updates. This is KUAT-FM 90.5 and 89.7 in Tucson, broadcasting from the University of Arizona. I'm David Harrington, and we've been rushing to get information indeed. So far, Governor Hull says there are no indications of any terrorist threat in Arizona at this time. She spoke from Phoenix, and she says she's taken a number of precautionary steps, such as increased security patrols in state buildings. A federal aviation official says all of the commercial aircraft in U.S. skies have now reached their destination. No additional takeoffs have been allowed in the aftermath of today's attacks. Customs Service is on heightened alert status at ports of entry along the United States-Mexico border. However, it says crossing points in Arizona are open at this time. The main highway between Arizona and Las Vegas, US 93, is closed at Hoover Dam.